Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn, as if they did not. Those who are happy, as if they were not. Those who buy something, as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world, as if not engrossed in them. For this world, in its present form, is passing away. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honourably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin he does right, but he who does not marry her does better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is. I think that I too have the Spirit of God.
Good. Me too. Again, a big welcome to our Sunday morning service, and particularly if you're a visitor with us this morning. If this is your first, second, or third time, very, 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 very happy to have you with us and joining us. As Toddy said, I am continuing to work through now, I think, a series that we kicked off early Feb, so it's been going for a while. We are slowly but surely working our way through Paul's first letter, at least the one that we have on record, to the church in Corinth. So again, as Toddy said, I'll be finishing up chapter 7 particularly, so verses 25 to 40. So Tim has already kindly done 2 parts on this for us, so I'm really doing the conclusion of chapter 7, verses 25 to 40. So that's what we'll be working through this morning. So some context and a little bit of recap, just to kind of jog people's memories, or again, if this is completely new to you. We're looking at a letter that Paul wrote to a church in a place called Corinth. So a big, bustling, cosmopolitan city in the Roman Empire. The place was thriving, people were very ambitious, people were very much on the go, and Paul had established the first Christian church there, so really like a network of house churches. He stayed there for, we think, about a year. He then left. He then entered into correspondence with that church over the course of the next couple of years, and the church would send messengers, like verbal messengers, as well as written correspondence to him about some of the issues and problems that they were facing as a church. There was some conflict, there were some disputes, there were some pretty thorny ethical issues, and this letter is one of Paul's responses to that church and the particular issues that they were having at the time. Now, if you've got any interest at all in spirituality, which you were here this morning, so I'm assuming that you do, if you're like me, one of the key criterion for assessing any potential faith or spirituality, or even, I guess, like a kind of ethical framework, is the very relevant question of what relevance does this spirituality have to my real life? Or at least what relevance does this spirituality have to those who I care about in their lives? Where's the relevance? Where does rubber actually meet the road? What's the impact that this spirituality or this faith is going to have on real life? And the good news is that this particular passage, by that criterion, would be high impact. Because this particular passage, 25 to 40, it first of all looks at and addresses anyone who is facing the possibility of getting married. So if the possibility of getting married for you is like a live option right now, good news, this sermon is going to be super relevant. So that's the first bit of good news. But on top of that, and this is really, really, really like important, I think Paul is using the example of the possibility of getting married. He's using that as an example of a larger principle and point. And that larger principle and point is this passage is going to be fantastic for you if you are facing any big decision in your life right here, right now. And I would put money down on the fact that everyone in this room is on the brink of some quite big, important decision. So the good news is this sermon is going to be super relevant for you as well. So how does Paul respond to this issue? Again, the specific example is someone who's considering getting married or not. But again, more broadly, how does he respond to someone who's finding themselves on the brink of making any big decision? I'm going to argue he's got 4 perspectives for us. So these are my read on Paul's 4 big perspectives on big decision making. So we're going to hear Paul's perspective being a pastor. We're going to hear Paul's perspective being more of a pragmatist. We're going to hear Paul talk about decisions in terms of priorities. And we're going to hear, hopefully intriguingly enough, Paul talking about decision-making from the perspective of being a possession. More on that later. So the rest of this talk is really going to be working through those 4 different perspectives. So if you've got your Bibles with you, which I hope you do, please crack them open now if you haven't done so already. We're looking at 1 Corinthians 7, again, verses 25 to 40, and we'll be jumping around a little bit. So it'd be good to have it there in front of you. Before we get into the first perspective of Paul the pastor, just a little bit more. This will be the last bit of background and context. You will see in verse 25, Paul starts, if you've got the NIV at least, Paul starts this section of the letter. I think it's the only time it pops up in Scripture with the line, literally, now about virgins. So now about virgins. Why did Paul start that bit of the letter with that term, and what did he even mean by that term back then? So this is something that is somewhat debated between commentators, but most of them land on the fact that virgins, a kind of good understanding, modern understanding of what Paul meant by that term, is really anyone who wasn't married as yet. Anyone who wasn't married as yet. So another way to render that is those who are yet to marry. Those who are yet to marry. And we've got to remember, back then, in that context, marriage was a norm, right? So marriage was a norm in society back then. And being a virgin pre-marriage was a particular ideal of the day, particularly for women. So chances are Paul is responding to questions and concerns, again, raised by the church in Corinth about this issue. What may they be concerned about? Now, at the time, again, we've got to remember, in some philosophical and spiritual circles, celibacy and chastity was seen as being high status and desirable. So not getting caught up in sex and messy human relationships was seen by some people in some circles to allow more time for more noble pursuits, such as philosophy or contemplating the spiritual life, or even like political service, civil service. And this attitude of, again, celibacy and chastity being high status may have started to actually creep into the church at Corinth. So, sure, you can have sex and marriage if you just want to be a regular Christian, but if you want to be spiritually elite, if you want to be the equivalent of the Christian Special Forces at the time, like the A-Team, then get ready to wrap both arms around extreme chastity, because that is the higher noble path. So if that was a question that was on the mind of some of those in Corinth, then the natural question that they'd pose to Paul, again, like the church's founder, would be something like, Paul, like marriage. Should I or shouldn't I? And maybe I'm asking for a friend. I've got this mate over here and he's betrothed or he's engaged. Should he follow through with it? Or Paul, I'm actually asking on behalf of my mum. You may remember she lost her husband in the plague last year and she's met this great guy at our local house church. They're both into chariot racing. It's fantastic. I think they're a great match. Should she remarry? And here again are the four ways that I think Paul responds in this passage. And really importantly, again, think through the lens of these could be applied to any big life decision that you're on the brink of making. Okay, so first of all, we've got Paul, the pastor. Now, what do I mean by pastor? So I'm using that term pastor, as I think it's usually used in the New Testament, to describe someone who almost sees themselves as or feels that God has called them to be a shepherd of people. So really importantly, good pastors are concerned about individual sheep. Good shepherds are concerned about individual sheep, not just a general flock. So Paul, being a good pastor, is concerned about guiding and encouraging and loving individual people who are under his care, not just the church as a kind of mass of humanity. And you see, again, if you're following along, in verse 25 onwards, he is really humble and honest here. So in verse 25, he makes it clear that he's got an opinion about this, and it's not just a kind of everyday opinion. We're talking about Paul, a great spiritual leader here. So his opinion carries weight. It's almost like a serious judgment that deserves to be chewed over. But at the same time, whilst having that authority, he makes it clear that he is not kind of speaking on behalf of God in that regard. It is not a command. It doesn't have that weight, and it's okay for the people, again, his flock, to disagree with his opinion. That's fine. And secondly on this, as Paul being a pastor, he allows for people's particular situations to count in terms of how they should make decisions. So again, look at verses 36b and 37, if you've got it there in front of you. He says, if you're engaged and you want to follow through with that, then fine. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. That is a good thing. But in verse 37, he then says, if you go through a process and responsibly land on breaking off that engagement and not to marry, that's also completely okay. So both two very different outcomes, but both okay, depending upon the particular circumstances of the individuals involved. So this is like pastoral, right? This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Paul is saying your individual and particular circumstances matter in your decision-making. And if you look at verse 36 again, he even brings in, first of all, the role of feelings, desires, and a concern for other people who may be involved in your decision-making process. So Paul encourages the hypothetically engaged guy to consider the woman that he's engaged to. That's the first thing. He wants that guy to consider the feelings of someone else who's involved in his decision-making process. And secondly, he wants this guy to kind of assess, be honest about the degree of passion that he has towards this woman. So one way of thinking about this is, are you so into this person, so hypothetical engaged guy, are you so into this person who you're betrothed to that their absence would preoccupy you? Would you notice their absence so much it would distract you? If so, then get married. And check out Paul's motives for dispensing this kind of advice in verse 35. He writes, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you. So really importantly, Paul has a genuine concern for the people that he's writing to. He doesn't want to be the fun police. He's not doing it because he wants to be Mr. Morality. He's doing it, he's writing this stuff because he cares about them. He loves them. He's concerned about them. So Paul is pastoral. And here's the big takeaway for us. If you find yourself on the brink of making a big life decision, then find someone in your life who you can seek that kind of counsel from. So someone who will give you their opinion, their honest opinion, with the right degree of humility and honesty, and someone who actually knows your particular situation, who understands your circumstances. And be pastoral both to yourself, but also the other people who are going to be affected by this decision that you're about to make. Who will be affected? How will they feel? What are your felt convictions? Consider all that stuff. Be pastoral to yourself. So that's the first one, be pastoral. But that's not enough. Paul is also pragmatic. So again, if you looked at this passage, and if you ask that question, Paul, should I get married? So that again, that's the specific example. Paul, should I get married? And his answer, one of his answers is like, look, you may be better off alone. And you may be better off alone, you read there, because of the present crisis. And so like, what is the present crisis that he's referring to? As Tim explained in a couple of sermons ago on this, most commentators conclude that at the time of writing, there was a widespread and severe famine in the empire. And most of us, I'd wager, in this room, haven't really experienced a widespread and severe famine firsthand. Maybe you don't even have any friends who have been through that. And particularly the kind of widespread famine that back in those days would have been rife. So married couples were expected to have children at the time. Okay, so married couples were expected to have as many children as possible. Do you want to run the risk of seeing your multiple children starve in front of you in the midst of a famine? That's the first thing. Second, married men at the time had an obligation to care for their extended family, including their in-laws. And perhaps crucially, the married man, once he was married, would have had to be relatively subservient to his father-in-law. You know, look after him, maybe follow through with his desires and whims. So you've got to ask the question, would you want your in-laws to suffer in the midst of a famine? Maybe don't answer that one. But like seriously, like, these are practical concerns, right? These are practical concerns. Chances are Paul had been married before because he was a Pharisee, right? And it was typical, almost expected that Pharisees, that religious caste at the time, would have been married. Perhaps his wife had died. Perhaps he had to live through that. Perhaps she had left him after his dramatic conversion from regular, typical Judaism to, you know, suddenly radical and kind of fringy Christianity. Either way, when he writes in verse 28 there, but those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this, he's likely writing from some experience. He knows what he's talking about. Paul is just pointing out the hard truth that relationships will be costly. So factor that into your decision-making. Factor that into your decision-making. But there's an even more important pragmatic factor here. What's the big criterion that Paul is using to help determine whether one should get married or not? You'll see there in verse 34 where he writes, devotion to the Lord. And that's important enough that he repeats it almost immediately in verse 35, devotion to the Lord. So here's the pragmatic question about relationships, but also any other big commitment or concern that you may be facing a decision about. Will it increase your devotion? Will it likely increase your devotion to Jesus? Or will it divide that devotion? Will this decision, the result of it, will it pull you in two different directions? That's the big criterion. Now, really importantly, again, don't forget that Paul is pastoral. So he cares about people's unique and particular circumstances and situations. And he is both pro-sex in marriage as well. So he's all for marriage and he's all for sex in marriage. So he's not putting up being single or celibate as being spiritually or morally superior than marriage. It is crucially whichever path leads you as an individual to greater devotion to Christ. That's the criterion. Which path will lead you as an individual, being single or being married, which one is more likely to increase your devotion to Christ? I like to run, or more accurately, I try to jog. I like to try to jog. And I don't need company when I do so. I like you, but I don't really want to hear you heavy breathing by my side for 5Ks, okay? It's not personal. And if you happen to be fitter than me, I don't want to be like left heavy breathing next to you for 5Ks while you're asking me 20 questions. That's going to be embarrassing. And I like jogging, right? I just naturally like jogging, so I don't need the motivation of company to help me jog. But you may be different. The only thing that might get you from couch to 5K is the thought of someone like screaming next to you, something like pain is only weakness leaving the body, or you go girl, I don't know. And the point is that's fine, that's absolutely fine. Your devotion to running is increased with company, okay? You see that? Your devotion to running is actually increased with company. It's pragmatic. So the takeaway principle here is that when it comes to your big decisions, please, use your God-given book of Proverbs wisdom. Don't think that considering real-world complications and practicalities like famines and in-laws, don't regard that stuff as being unspiritual, because Paul didn't. And most importantly, ask that guiding question: will this likely increase or decrease my devotion to Christ? That's the question. So thus far, we've got pastoral and we've got pragmatic perspectives. But again, these by themselves aren't enough. Paul spends the middle of this passage talking about priorities. And this is kind of dense, it's complicated, so we're going to spend a little bit of time here. It's important to see that he's using what they call the literary device of hyperbole, which is just like a fancy sounding word for exaggeration to make a point. So he uses a lot of exaggeration here to make a point. So again, look at verses 29 to 32. They are bracing, to say the least. This is my paraphrase. So he says, like, you've got a wife or presumably a husband, disregard. You find yourself mourning, get over it. You got some cool stuff, you're happy? Stop fooling yourself. The other shoe's going to drop. You got some cool stuff that you collected? You won't be taking that with you, mate. And have you accumulated some useful and fun skills and hobbies? Don't get carried away. Don't go getting ahead of yourself. And you can ask, Paul, why are you saying all of this? Like, why are you sounding so extreme? And the answer in the passage is because this world in its present form is passing away and the time is short. What a buzzkill. It'd be great to be stuck next to Paul at a dinner party when he was in that kind of mood. But this is a really great example of the importance of having a good enough, not perfect, but good enough way to interpret your Bible. If you took this passage, again, particularly that 29 to 32, by itself and at face value, you could be forgiven for leaving your partner, going off grid in the bush and stocking up on ammo and canned food, whilst waiting for Jesus to return next week and wrap the whole thing up. If that's all you took. Hence, it's critical to remember to interpret Scripture with other parts of the Bible. So the meaning of this passage, our little passage here, should be interpreted in light of what other parts of the Bible have to say, and they should not contradict each other. So let's remember, when it comes to making sense of this passage, Paul has already encouraged people to get married and stay married, first of all. Paul says in other letters that we should rejoice with those who rejoice and we should mourn with those who mourn. So he's a big fan of empathy. Paul planted churches in Corinth who met in houses that were so large that only wealthy Christians could own them. So Paul is not sell everything you got to everyone and go. Paul has a place in his theology for people who are rich and who follow Christ and who are generous with that wealth. And Paul, in other letters, instructs Christians to look after their relatives, their elderly relatives, and work hard at their jobs. So an extreme reading of this passage, reading in terms of retreating from society, from being super stoic and super ascetic, and not making any medium to long-term plans, I think we can take that option off the table. Instead, how about think about it this way? So again, I'll just unpack this in steps. Remember the section that preceded this one. So remember verse 24. I think Tim spoke on it last week. Paul writes, so just before our section, Paul writes, brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation or the calling that they were in when God called them. So specifically in this context, Paul is talking to slaves and freedmen. But just like our passage, they were examples of a larger point. And here's that larger point. Remember, Corinth was a city that had a status and self-promotional culture. And this had probably infected the church. Christians were likely becoming preoccupied with their place on the social ladder and how to better position themselves and advance. Even a slave or a free person, get this, this was news to me, even a slave or free person could take the risky step of selling themselves into slavery to the right influential master who had high status in the society. Because if I was a slave to a high master, then I will get vicarious status from that. Does that make sense? So I could take that chance if I wanted to. So even slaves had that drive to self-promote and try to advance. The Corinthians were striving. I'm a striver in my way. I like to socially advance and better my position. And I can get preoccupied with that. And I expect a lot of you guys can too. And Paul effectively says in verse 24, look, just stop striving. Just stop striving. Instead, trust God to look after you, whatever your circumstances are, and stop striving to advance up some kind of social ladder. That was verse 24, but I think this passage makes a similar and complementary point. I think Paul is saying both stop striving for status and start seeing things relatively. What do I mean by relatively? I reckon a lot of you are going to be able to relate to this. When I was in my early 20s, Friday nights were all about leaving the house to go somewhere fun and do something with my friends and my wife. And that doing something usually involved spending a fair bit of money on myself, and it resulted in sleeping in on Saturday mornings. That was all pre-kids. Now, say my typical Friday night now involves leaving the house to go transport the kids to somewhere that I don't really want to go, and I don't think it's really going to be like that much fun, so they can do something with their friends, and that something is usually going to cost me a lot of money. And that'll be followed up by getting up early on a Saturday morning so I can go take them to their soccer game as well, okay? And the truth is, most of the time, I don't mind. I don't mind. Earlier in life, Friday night was more important than Saturday morning, but now, as they say, Saturday morning is more important than a big Friday night. That's changed. Now, I still enjoy, seeing friends on Friday nights. I enjoy occasionally staying out late on Friday nights with them, but all that is relative, right? It is relative to playing Uber driver to my kids and being relatively alert and available to them on a Saturday morning. Does that make sense? So, still good things, right? But their relative importance has diminished. It's been reprioritized. And I think that's the point that Paul is making here. These examples that he mentions, joy, sadness, relationships, possessions, experiences, and the world in its present form, none of these things are bad things, not at all. But they are no longer ultimate things. They're no longer the most important thing or things. They've been relativized. So he doesn't want us to be worried, preoccupied, or unduly concerned with them. Because relatively speaking, they are no longer that important. Why is this? Because, as he wrote, the world in its current form is passing away. Verse 31. Again, this is worth unpacking. What does this mean? What does this mean? Really importantly, I don't think, based on my reading and research, that Paul is not referring so much to creation itself passing away. So he's not talking about like the actual created order, humans and creation passing away. It's the world in the sense of institutions, ways of life, ideas of progress, worldviews and systems. All those things, he's saying, are always kind of transient. So, I was thinking about this. In my lifetime, we've had at least 20 years now, at least like 2 decades of relative peace and stability on a global scale. But now that I can see riots in LA when I turn on my TV, it reminds me that in the early 90s, I could turn on my TV and see riots in LA. I'm pretty sure when I was really young and growing up that the USSR was the boogeyman. And then for a while, they were our friends. And now they seem to be like the boogeyman again. Baggy jeans were hip in the 90s and early 2000s. And then skinny jeans came in for a while. And now baggy jeans are back again. Everything's transient, right? The world is constantly changing. It's always passing away. But perhaps what's even more confronting about that kind of like large-scale world passing away is that, and I know this can sting a little bit, but your world is passing away as well. My world is passing away. And there are numerous reminders of this. In my situation, my youngest is going to finish primary school this year. Both my sons will be in high school. My world, that is passing away. Or you have that oldest friend who dies way too suddenly. Or you have that new boss that is younger than you. Or you find out that the person you had a serious crush on in college is now a grandparent. Congratulations, man. Your world is passing away. Your world is passing away. And perhaps what's more disconcerting is that the larger world keeps on going. But even the world in its current compromised form will also eventually pass away. and be renewed when Jesus' kingdom is ushered in. So Paul says, given all of that, don't be unduly concerned with the affairs of this world. Verse 33. Don't undervalue the good things that God's given us and the experiences that he grants us, but don't invest too much value in them. Don't become preoccupied with them, and don't chase after status. Instead, he writes in verse 32, be concerned about the Lord's affairs, how you can please the Lord. So this, of course, matters. What pleases the Lord, and what are his affairs? And this question, it's not exactly answered in our particular passage, but not too much further on in this letter. Paul mentions in different ways the importance of becoming all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. So Paul is saying he's certain one thing that pleases God and one thing that God is certainly concerned about is people who don't know him coming to know and love and follow him. And in other letters, and all through this one too, Paul also writes about the importance of loving and supporting the people who already love and follow Jesus. So build people up, both within the church and outside of the church. That, Paul says, concerns God. That pleases God. So a shorthand answer, just a quick summary, to answer the question, what concerns God, what pleases God, what are his affairs, is this. It's people. God is concerned with people. Seeing people love and follow Jesus. God is really into that. Doing what we can to love and build people up, both within and without the church. God is super into that. That pleases him. God is concerned about that stuff. And this all makes sense, right? Because if you believe that the world in its current form is actually passing away, then you still hold on to the fact that people made in God's image, people are eternal. What will last? What will actually last and go from this world to the next? I heard one preacher say it's going to be people and praise. So praise from God. God giving you praise because you glorified him with the time and the resources that you had. People and those praises from God will be the two things that last into eternity. And I'd add, for my money, renewed creation too, but that's a side subject. So we want to see people, if we're concerned about pleasing God and we're concerned about God's affairs, we want to see people in God's kingdom. We want to spend eternity with them. So we want them to become Christians. That has eternal value. And we want to love and support people in the here and now as well. So bringing all this one together, Paul wants us to prioritize when it comes to making the big decisions. Don't get worried, don't get anxious, don't get preoccupied about bettering our situations, about advancing our status, about accumulating possessions or experiences. Instead, be devoted, be concerned about what God is devoted to and concerned with, about loving people, seeing them become followers of his, and bringing him glory. Use that frame when it comes to your big decision making. And look, the risk is I say all that, and it just sounds like way too theoretical and way too abstract. That brought to mind a more practical conversation or example I had, and this literally happened like 2 or 3 days ago. I was having a conversation with a Christian friend, my age and stage, and he'd worked out that if he just worked a little bit harder and a little bit longer over the next 3 or 4 years, he and his family would be close to being financially independent. And that's a noble goal, right? Like that sounds pretty respectable in our circles, being financially independent. He associated being financially independent with having freedom and with having more options in life. And after reaching financial independence, he could perhaps do a bit of part-time work, take that money and give it to charitable and worthy causes. Again, this all sounds great. But we kept on talking and we soon concluded it's just not that simple. First, there's the motives. Being financially independent has a lot of status attached to it in our society and circles. Your motives for wanting to attain that can become murky with time, if we're honest with ourselves. It can be a risk that pride and this idea of self-sufficiency creeps in. But the larger concern is the opportunity cost. This is what my friend started to conclude. If your limited attention, if your limited time, if your limited headspace is being primarily devoted to working harder and longer for money now, It means it cannot be devoted to the real needs of people that God has already placed you amongst. That God has already placed you amongst. Our kids could do with more attention today. My kids could do with more of my attention today. I've got friends that could do with that phone call this week. There are people who aren't sitting in the pew next to you, haven't been here this week or last week for reasons beyond their control, who could do with a visit in the next fortnight. And that colleague at work or that direct report that you have could really do with your undivided attention and care in the here and now, rather than part of you being preoccupied with how you get that next promotion. Do you see what I mean? There is God's work to do that has eternal value right here, right now. And if I am preoccupied, again, thinking about, well, how do I advance my position? How do I climb to the next thing? How do I get here and there and there? How do I save up more money so I can get away? All that kind of stuff. Again, all well and good. But if I get preoccupied with that stuff, it takes me away from what I think God would have me do right now where he has me. So we can so easily waste our attention and time on status and security improving pursuits that are, and this is the crazy thing, they are related to a future I can't even see properly, let alone guarantee it. But I'm spending all this time and headspace planning for it. But again, it's at the expense of what is of eternal value right here and right now in front of me. So look, like Paul wrote in verse 24, you've got to believe God has called you in some mysterious way and a meaningful way to the particular context you find yourself in. And now. And again, critically, so he's not so much concerned with a fantasy life that you may have. The real life you have may be far from ideal. It may be full of challenges. But as Anthony Thistleton, a great commentator on Corinthians, wrote, the first thing is to be a Christian, and that in all circumstances. And our following Jesus is actually lived out through the circumstances, the institutions we find ourselves in, and in the midst of our anxieties and constraints, not in spite of them. Isn't that good? God will work. Like, God doesn't have to change our situation to work. God can work, again, through our current situation, as unideal as we think that is. So, again, Paul teaches that we need to prioritise, we need to see the good things of the world in a relative light compared to people and his praises. So that's pastoral, that's pragmatic, that's prioritisation. The final one, possession, and this will be nice and short. And it probably is the most important one, possession. If you're like me, you can just so easily sail through life mistakenly thinking that you're making plans, you're establishing goals, you're casting visions as an independent and free agent, answerable and supported by no one or nothing higher than yourself. But as Paul wrote earlier in verses 22 to 24, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should act accordingly. So really importantly, if you call yourself a Christian here this morning, you don't belong to yourself. You don't really belong to anyone else either. But the sobering news is that you were never really truly free to begin with. You were, as sobering as it sounds, a slave, like me, a slave to sin and evil, and then you were bought at the greatest price knowable, the death of Christ, in order to be his treasured possession. And with that comes responsibility for the decisions that we make, but it also brings great and true comfort and freedom. So, sure, like an ancient household slave or servant, many who had high levels of responsibility and influence, you need to represent your master Jesus across all your decisions, particularly the big ones. So should I. But also, like a good master at that time, Jesus is ultimately responsible for your care and for your future. Because that's partly what being in his possession means. And that means I don't have to frantically chase status and security. I don't have to get sucked into the stupid ladder climbing games of the world. And I could be freed of carrying around that internal attitude of constantly craving external status and validation. You see? That is a true version of freedom and liberty. So to summarise and conclude, if you're a Christian here and you're on the brink of making a big significant decision, which again I think like a lot of us are, and it doesn't have to be whether you're ever going to marry or not, consider those perspectives. Be pastoral to yourself and others who are going to be affected, and seek the counsel of someone who you trust and someone who knows your particular circumstances. Be pragmatic. So look, don't over-spiritualize the decision-making process. Use your God-given wisdom to consider the likely realities you're going to face with this decision. And prioritise. What will lead to me likely increasing my devotion to God as opposed to having that taken away? What will more align with his concerns about people and bringing him glory, furthering his kingdom, as opposed to prioritising the concerns of a world that is just passing away and advancing my status and position? And finally, possession. Because again, Christian, you've got to believe you are not your own. Your decision should positively reflect upon Jesus, your master. And seriously, like he has you. He's got you. And if you're a non-Christian here this morning, or if you're on the fence, take some comfort in this as well, right? You don't have to feel crushed and frustrated under the awful, and I'd say misguided weight of thinking that you are ultimately responsible for running your own life and making it a success. Because that is a horrible burden. Losing sleep and hyperventilating constantly because you're thinking, man, this one big decision will set the course of my life. And this life is the only one that I have. The good news is that A, you are not that powerful and neither am I. And the even better news is that this life is not the only one. So you can actually afford to make mistakes and know that it would be okay because a loving, more powerful God has you in hand and can course correct you and use even your mistakes to his glory and your betterment. And that is truly good news. So please, like always, hopefully that was helpful. Afterwards, if you're a Christian here, and again, you feel like you're on the brink of a big decision and you're worried about that, and you're worried about, again, messing up your prioritization, please come down the front. Someone would love to pray with you and for you. If you're a non-Christian here and you want to know more, or again, you were just feeling understandably overwhelmed, you're feeling crushed with the burden, the responsibility of having to make big decisions, please come down the front. Someone would love to talk to you and pray with you through that. And if you want prayer about anything else, nothing to do with the sermon whatsoever, please come on down the front. Someone would love to pray with you and for you. I'll just say a super quick prayer now. Father, thank you again for this letter. I thank you that Paul's pastoral heart just reflects your pastoral heart. You love us as individuals. You created us uniquely. You don't see us as a massive, undifferentiated humanity, but individuals who are made in your image. Father, I pray with your Spirit, touch ours to live lives that bring you glory and that are invested in the same things that you are, people and their worth. Amen.